We begin our story in the USA, in Texas, for no particular reason other than that this is a story about Thanksgiving, although we've got another year to wait yet. We're here with Gobble, the turkey, the quintessential symbol of Thanksgiving in America. In the wild, turkeys can live up to 10 years old, even though they often don't get past 6 months to be on the table for Thanksgiving. But for this story, we're going to add a little cinematic license. Our turkey is 1 year old. Has implicit memory, meaning it has a form of self-awareness that doesn't include being able to think about itself in the third person, and has 1 year left until slaughter. Now, every day, with every meal, the bird is reinforced with the implicit belief that, as Nassim Taleb shares in his book The Black Swan, it is the general rule of life to be fed every day by friendly members of the human race, looking out for its best interests, as a politician would say. The Black Swan hit the bookshelves with a degree of impact not unlike what that turkey got a few days before Thanksgiving. It's about the impact of the highly improbable and our seeming blindness to the many unprecedented, punitive events that await us in life. It's an idea that is essential to understand if we're going to determine why we don't know what we don't know. Taleb continues, on the afternoon of the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, something unexpected will happen to the turkey. It would incur a revision of belief. From a human standpoint, the turkey could have done everything right in appraising danger. We preach the importance of learning from history and knowing the past, and while important, would have little helped Gobble. Instead, every day he was alive, his guardian arrived in the morning with a generous helping of food, and he felt increasingly safe, even though danger became more and more imminent. Knowledge from the past was not advantageous. In fact, it provided a false sense of security. Not questioning one's narrative about the future can be a very expensive oversight indeed. As much as we'd like to dismiss it, we're not unlike Gobble the turkey in matters of predicting a future that's never happened to us before. If you look at just a handful of human black swan events, the financial crisis of 2008, World War I, September the 11th, the similarities are a little unnerving. Take Captain E.J. Smith, who confidently established that he had never been in any kind of ship accident worth speaking about. I have seen but one vessel in distress in all my years at sea. I never saw a wreck and never have been wrecked, nor was I ever in any predicament that threatened to end in disaster of any sort. He died on the Titanic in 1912. With the story out of the way, we're on to part 2, science, to see what objective truths the story might highlight, but first, with an all-essential caveat. Science isn't broken, but it's a hell of a lot harder than we give it credit for, to paraphrase the data analysis blog 538. What does this mean? Well, humans are not rational creatures. Scientists are no different. We see patterns, we unconsciously jump to conclusions, we screen data to confirm our hypotheses, and as a result struggle to replicate findings. Point is, just because I mention the word science doesn't mean you should take these studies as gospel. Lessons can be taken, but sleep with one eye open. Correlation is not causation. Read my favourite book in the world to understand more. To understand why we don't know what we don't know, we're going to think about the problem from 3 perspectives: the past, the present, and the future. And to do this, we'll explore 2 big ideas, all of which curiously come from the works of the same man, the founder of behavioural economics, Daniel Kahneman. These 2 big ideas are effective forecasting and the availability heuristic. Understanding why we don't know what we don't know is a topic that ultimately requires a greater understanding about the brain, which science doesn't yet have. But through these 2 topics, we can make solid progress in our understanding. Let's start with effective forecasting, which is a label for how we anticipate the emotional impact of future events. Kahneman introduced the research on this area of psychology in the early 1990s, an offshoot from his prolific work on decision-making, for which he'd earned a Nobel Prize in economics in 2002. But the term effective forecasting was actually later coined by Harvard psychologist Daniel Gilbert, author of the fantastic book Stumbling on Happiness, one of my favourite books of all time. It studies, for example, how we anticipate the happiness we'll get from buying a new car, or how we anticipate the sadness from the loss of a family pet. More specifically, this idea is called the impact bias, one vertical of study within the area of effective forecasting. As Wikipedia states today, it's the tendency for people to overestimate the length or intensity of future feeling states. When we buy the car, we expect the happiness to implicitly never end. When we lose a family pet, we expect the sadness to never end. It turns out we're pretty bad at predicting how we'll feel in the future, because rather than perceiving an emotional arc that acknowledges the role of desensitization, we blindly limit our awareness at predicting the high impact and presume it will last. Happiness lasts forever, sadness lasts forever in relation to specific events. This is implicit rather than necessarily conscious. We might say that this idea is intellectually absurd, but emotionally will fail to remedy the oversight. So that's one of three, the future. But it turns out that the future is inextricably connected with the past. In fact, we learn from the past in order to predict the future, as we learn in the story of the turkey. The past is extrapolated into the future. But as Nassim Taleb notes, it's little more than a naive projection that, when left unquestioned as a blind, compulsive narrative offered by the brain without conscious effort, can couple us with a big fat black swan. It's even been hypothesized that the only reason for memory is so that we can better predict the future. As neuroscientist Daniel Wolpert notes in his TED Talk on the real reason for brains, he notes, there can be no evolutionary advantage to laying down memories of childhood or perceiving the color of a rose if it doesn't affect the way you're going to move later in life. Fundamentally, this is about survival. The only problem, of course, is that the past doesn't tell us about events that have never happened, a problem of proportions that's difficult to quantify. So that's the future and the past. Finally, there is the present, which is where we explore the second idea, another which derives from Daniel Kahneman's work, and that is the availability heuristic, a term that he himself coined. As Wikipedia currently states, the availability heuristic is a mental shortcut that relies on immediate examples that come to a given person's mind when evaluating a specific topic, concept, method, or decision. What this means is that in the present, we don't immediately have access to all the information that exists in our brain. Many people believe memory works kind of like a filer. You put something in and it sits there untouched until you retrieve it. But as ideal as this would be, it's unfortunately not that simple. More accurately, memories are recreated in the brain every time we want to retrieve them, and it's very unlikely any particular memory is reproduced exactly the same. Over time, connections in the brain are weakened, we forget things, and we also add in details to form coherent recalls in light of new experiences. We'll explore this fabrication process a little more shortly. So that's the present. Now, coming back to our core question, why don't we know what we don't know? Let's clarify this question. Why don't we know when we are in a state of ignorance? Why do we so often have confident opinions on things we don't actually know? Why do we often conflate mere opinions as absolute fact? Well, if we look through the lens of effective forecasting, it becomes clearer that we're not good at predicting an unknown future, only known futures that derive from past experience. What's worse, it becomes clear that the future we can conceive, if it happens at all, is actually an inadequate and surface-level simulation of what will happen. And if we consider the availability heuristic in the present, it becomes clearer that not only are there things that we don't know, let's say how many stars are in the Milky Way, but that we also don't have complete recall of the information we do in fact know at any one time. It takes time for the brain to, in effect, recreate that memory, and even then, it's partially fabricated. This leads us to one simple conclusion, that we live in a crazily uncertain world. I mean, a complete spaghetti junction, atom storm, discombobulated helter-skelter of a world. It's crazy. And if we saw things the way they were, if we were aware of the 3-pound brain's limitations for processing the highly complex world around us, boy, we wouldn't get out of bed in the morning. We'd be shivering bundles of nervous wrecks. Fortunately, the human brain has evolved a knack for adapting, no doubt essential to survival if the brain is going to be limited to a certain size as befits the limits of earthly physics. As Daniel Gilbert notes in his fantastic PBS series This Emotional Life, human beings have a talent for adapting, a talent for finding happiness where we least expect it. So this is the world in which we've evolved, and in order to survive, we've also developed the mental apparatus to become adept at making sense of things in a split second, and without 100% of the information technically needed to make a rational decision. And this is why we don't know what we don't know. The brain can't process a raw feed of the world, and even then, it's not omniscient. Processing a raw data feed through our senses wouldn't allow us to predict hurricanes, for example, so it blocks out the high degree of uncertainty surrounding us in order to reduce anxiety, what's probably known as cognitive dissonance, that dis-ease of feeling that something can't be understood. In lieu of getting the full picture, we necessarily get truncated pockets of information about the world. However, without context, those pockets are meaningless. Thus, the brain is a narrative-creating machine, and this is where the fabrication derives from. To dive a little deeper, these narratives are a form of compression and efficiency. Very simplified, two narratives we have memorized involving the concept of bread can reuse the same neuron associated with bread, whereas if bread was represented by an isolated neuron in the brain, it cannot be reused because it doesn't share any context. It's wastage, and given that the conscious mind can only hold a very limited amount of information at any one time, the compression is an efficiency, even though it comes at the expense of producing a propensity to stereotype, generalize, and occasionally make up. All of the discriminatory behaviors that people waste their lives losing their minds on is actually an indication of the brain's limits rather than a conspiratorial ignorance. More effectively, we might design environments in ways that discourage discrimination, but those feelings will persist. We evolved in far smaller groups than we have now. Intellectually, there are no strangers on Earth, but emotionally, we still perceive those different to us as possible threats. In more extreme examples, this pattern-seeking behavior results in a belief in astrology, in superstition, finding patterns where they don't exist. Typically, it simply allows us to communicate effectively and coherently with others and to remain perceptively sane ourselves. In psychiatry, we might use the term confabulation, defined as the production of fabricated, distorted, or misinterpreted memories about oneself or the world. This doesn't contain the conscious intention to deceive. Individuals who confabulate present incorrect memories ranging from subtle alterations to bizarre fabrications, and are generally very confident about their recollections, despite contradictory evidence. Associating the term with psychiatry makes it seem like a problem, but it's actually essential if we're to function at all. Over the past 30 years, our understanding of memory has swirled. To just cherry-pick some experts in the field, all contributing their own insight, we have the quirky experiences of the late great neurologist Oliver Sacks in his book The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, and the fascinating studies of the psychologist Elizabeth Loftus, including her TED Talk with well over 3 million views, or the research of Harvard's Daniel Schachter with his book The 7 Sins of Memory. We now have a comprehensive wealth of information about the composition of memory. Studies are often done with mentally ill patients, but equally with perfectly healthy average people. Our memories are a disjointed tapestry of info bytes weaved together on demand to provide our conscious mind with something we can work with, something we can communicate to our family with, something we can alert our friends with, an opportunity to learn and to teach through the art of storytelling, a connected beginning, middle, and end. This simplification of the past is known in social science as the hindsight bias, the idea that things always seem to be explainable with 20/20 clarity once we're looking back at them. But this is a mirage. Unfortunately, given that we use the past to predict the future, it also causes us to assume future events may be easier to predict than they really are. We don't know what we don't know because our brain doesn't tell us, and while this allows us to avoid being burdened with the true chaos of objective reality, it means that we need to step up our game if we're to be pragmatic, responsible, and live in pursuit of scientific truth. That brings us on to the takeaways from today's episode. The biggest takeaway for yourself today might just be trying to become a little more humble. The vast majority of people on this planet wake up in the morning and assume that they're getting the full picture, that if they see it, that's what it is in reality. But think for a second about the last time you saw a red sky at sunset. That colour wasn't the same for everyone around the world. It was determined by the density of atmosphere the light has to pass through before it gets to your eyes. At 12 noon, the atmosphere is relatively thin, leaving blue as the strongest colour with its short wavelengths as processed by your brain. When light travels along a path through the atmosphere with pollution particles and dust, the increased scattering of light causes longer wavelengths of red and yellow to seep through. Not everyone in the world saw that red sky. You saw red because the perspective of the sun into your eyes and brain made it appear that way. The world you see is not just existing out there. There is no red, there is no blue, only your brain's interpretation of atomized code, which all humans happen to interpret in a similar way. When you hear people arguing about what they saw versus what someone else saw, realize that perception is about perspective on many levels, rather than simply objective fact. Whatever you saw and whatever I saw, we're both right. By acknowledging that perspective dictates what we experience, and that, as we've learnt, our perspective actually misses a hell of a lot about the objective world, you lay a strong foundation for making better judgments throughout life. That our brain jumps to conclusions unconsciously is a mechanic that is innate. It's fundamental. If you consider that we have just 3 pounds of jelly between our ears trying to represent the entire world and universe, it becomes clear that corners must be cut. This means that getting a pure, unfiltered stream of reality is just not going to happen. We get chunks and join them together with disparate experiences we've had in the past before making naive projections about the future, and much of this doesn't require any effort. It's quite well known among people who specialise that the more you drill down into an area of study, the more typically it becomes clear that you don't know as much as you thought you did. Areas of ignorance become apparent, causing us to pause and question our presumptions. Lack of depth in specialisation leads inevitably to overconfidence, a staple of the politician who has a team of credible experts but only the cursory knowledge and understanding with which to make judgments. Unfortunately, the confabulation engine in our brains means that perceived knowledge will more likely lead to illusory understanding before true understanding. Consider a study Emory University recently did with Democrat and Republican politicians. Using fMRI, the subjects were given a reasoning task in which they had to evaluate threatening information about their own candidate. It was found there was no increased activation in parts of the brain normally engaged during reasoning. Compulsive narratives offered instinctively by the brain were not questioned by objective facts. This should worry you. Given the influence politicians have over your life, it should worry us all. Specialists in the political sphere, such as economists, are dismissed for leadership given their myopic specializations, but seemingly dynamic people able to wax lyrical on many topics, typical qualities espoused in great politicians, is a recipe for understanding the complexity of problems and making poor decisions. There's much literature on the overconfident leader. It's a catch-22. The employee needs to be confident in order to be promoted, but we live in a fundamentally uncertain world, so being confident comes with the sacrifice of realism. We live in a society where earnings do not correlate with living pragmatically. No one wants to hear from someone who offers all the reasons to be uncertain. Everywhere we look, incentives drive us to live in a soft state of delusion, and the more conspicuous version of that is the phenomenon of fake news. The important thing is to realise that fundamentally we can't be certain about anything. Fundamentally, right now, you're surrounded by vibrating atoms. Let that emasculate your ego. That attitude, however, doesn't deify humans driven for power. It deifies nature itself. It's a dilution of human power. With this in mind, I'd recommend getting in the habit of observing all facts you currently believe you know to be true merely as strongly held opinions. Inflexibility is weakness in adaptation. Even scientific fact is liable to change. Look at the replication struggles going on in social science right now. What was considered fact can be blown into the water overnight. A new insight into physics can upend decades of research in one fell swoop. We used to think that lightning could never strike the same place twice. We used to think that a penny dropped from the Empire State Building could kill an unsuspecting passerby. Then terminal velocity spoiled the party. A penny at 50 miles an hour hurts, but it won't kill you. I mean, if your head's on the sidewalk as you listen to the subway trains below ground and it falls in your ear, well, that could do some damage. Conditioning yourself to see facts rather than strongly held opinions keeps you from making an ass of yourself when someone calls you out. It protects you from being pulled into the propaganda of unsavory movements, and it's also a principle of thought whereby the conditions are very simple. All statements are some level of opinion. A fact today could be proved false tomorrow, depending on the framework of thought, the perspective from which we see something. By using this principle as a rule, it's simple to internalize into your judgment framework. To take a personal analogy, it's like running 7 days a week rather than 2 or 5. When I run, I avoid first asking the question, what day is it? Which can implicitly become an additional obstacle to building a new habit, an implicit excuse for procrastination. Ultimately, this is about good judgment on the world in which we live. And I'll leave you today with perhaps the best summary of what I'm talking about from legendary CEO of Intel, Andy Grove, who wrote a book of the same name. Only the paranoid survive. If you enjoyed today's episode, why not consider purchasing one of the books that inspired today's show? It helps the authors who write, me who produces, and you who implements. Thanks for watching, share your thoughts below, strike a like, and if you're feeling really daring, hover over the subscribe button and see what happens.